Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Defiance and watched 7 different alien fleets die in the space of 20 minutes. The massive view screen showed nothing but explosions and debris, where moments before the galaxy's finest warships had been fighting for their lives. The enemy moved through them like death itself, cutting down vessels that had never known defeat. Amy Rodriguez turned from her tactical station with fear in her eyes. She had been tracking the battle from long range, and the readings made no sense. Ships that could destroy planets were being torn apart like paper. The alien attackers seemed to know exactly where to hit and when to strike. Every defensive move the coalition forces made was countered before they could even complete it. "Captain, I'm getting distress signals from the Altarian flagship," Rodriguez reported. Her voice stayed steady, but Morrison could hear the shock underneath. "They're requesting immediate assistance, but their transmission is breaking up." The communication ended in static. On the screen, the massive Altarian dreadnought that had anchored the coalition's defense line split in half. Its reactor core went critical, and the explosion lit up half the star system. Morrison had seen that ship survive direct hits from asteroid-sized weapons. Now it was gone. Commander Lisa Grant moved to Morrison's side and spoke quietly. "Jake, we need to get out of here. Whatever those things are, they just wiped out the most powerful fleet in known space. The Defiance isn't built for this kind of fight." Morrison understood her concern. The USS Defiance was barely 200 meters long and carried a crew of only 50 humans. It had been designed for exploration and scientific research, not military combat. Even with the recent weapons upgrades, it was no match for the creatures that had just destroyed ships 10 times its size. But Morrison also knew something that Grant didn't. The communication networks were full of reports from across the galaxy. These attackers weren't just hitting military targets. They were moving systematically through every populated system, destroying everything in their path. Running would only delay the inevitable. "Chief Clark, what's our status?" Morrison called to the engineering section. Ryan Clark's voice came back through the intercom. "All systems operational, Captain. The new shield generators are holding steady, and weapons are charged. But sir, with respect, our railguns aren't going to scratch whatever just took out the coalition fleet." Morrison watched the tactical display as more ships died. The enemy vessels were unlike anything in the databases. They looked organic, like giant insects made of metal and flesh. They moved in perfect coordination and seemed to anticipate every move their opponents made. When the coalition ships tried flanking maneuvers, the attackers were already in position to counter them. When they attempted focused fire on individual targets, the enemy ships absorbed the damage and kept coming. Dr. Karen Phillips looked up from her science station with a troubled expression. "Captain, I'm analyzing the attack patterns, and there's something very wrong here. These creatures aren't just superior in firepower, they're learning. Each wave of attacks shows better coordination than the last. They're studying their opponents and adapting in real time." The implications hit Morrison immediately. If these attackers could learn and adapt during battle, then conventional military tactics would be useless against them. Every strategy that had worked against other enemies would become a weakness they could exploit. "Show me the tactical records from the beginning of the battle," Morrison ordered. Phillips brought up the data on the main screen. Morrison watched as the coalition forces opened with their standard attack formations. The enemy responded with defensive patterns that seemed almost casual, but as the battle progressed, the attackers began anticipating moves before the coalition ships even made them. By the end, they were countering strategies that hadn't even been implemented yet. They're not just learning, Morrison realized. They've done this before. They know our tactics because they've faced them 100 times against 100 different species. Grant stared at the data with growing horror. "You mean they've been doing this across the galaxy? Just moving from system to system, learning how everyone fights and then destroying them?" Before Morrison could answer, the long-range sensors detected movement. The enemy fleet was changing course. They were heading directly toward human space. Tony Barnes, the ship's security chief, checked his readings twice before reporting. "Captain, they're moving toward Earth. At their current speed, they'll reach our outer colonies in 6 days." Morrison felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders. Earth's defensive fleets were already mobilizing, but they would use the same tactics that had just failed so completely here. Humanity's military doctrine was based on the same principles as every other spacefaring species. They would study the enemy, develop countermeasures, and deploy them in organized formations. It would be a slaughter. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly, "we should warn Starfleet Command. They need to know what they're facing." Morrison considered this. The logical thing would be to race back to Earth and share everything they had learned. But what would that accomplish? Even with advance warning, human forces would still try to fight conventionally. They would analyze the enemy's capabilities and develop systematic responses. That was exactly what these creatures were designed to counter. Rachel Kim, the communications officer, was monitoring subspace channels when she spoke up. "Captain, I'm picking up transmissions from across the sector. These attackers have been active for months. They have destroyed the Centauri defense grid, the Vegan Trade Federation, and at least 12 other major civilizations. The pattern is always the same. They study, they learn, they adapt, and then they wipe out everything." Morrison walked to the view screen and stared at the debris field that had once been the galaxy's finest military force. 50,000 beings had died in less than an hour. Ships that had taken decades to build were now scattered atoms drifting in space. And somewhere out there, the creatures responsible were already moving toward their next target. "Chief Clark," Morrison said finally, "how long would it take to modify our systems for maximum unpredictability?" There was a pause before Clark responded. "Sir, I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean breaking every rule in the manual, running systems outside their designed parameters, making our ship as random and chaotic as possible." Grant looked at him with concern. "Jake, what are you thinking?" Morrison turned to face his crew. These people had followed him across the galaxy on exploration missions that had taken them to places no human had ever seen. They trusted his judgment even when his orders seemed crazy. He hoped that trust would hold for what he was about to ask them to do. "We're not running," he announced. "We're going to stop them." The bridge fell silent. Morrison could see his crew, processing what he had just said. One small exploration ship against an enemy that had just destroyed the most powerful fleet in galactic history. It sounded like suicide, but Morrison had spent years exploring the unknown regions of space. He had learned that the universe was full of surprises, and that conventional thinking was often the enemy of survival. If these creatures were designed to counter logical military tactics, then perhaps the answer was to abandon logic entirely. "Amy, plot an intercept course," he ordered. "We're going hunting." The USS Defiance followed the enemy fleet through hyperspace like a ghost tracking monsters. Morrison kept the ship just outside sensor range, close enough to monitor their movements, but far enough away to avoid detection. The enemy vessels moved, in perfect formation, their biomechanical hulls pulsing with alien energy as they traveled toward human space. Dr. Phillips worked around the clock analyzing everything they could detect about the attackers. She had started calling them the hegemony, based on their coordinated behavior and apparent collective intelligence. Each ship seemed connected to the others through some form of organic network, sharing information and tactical data in real time. "Captain, I've been studying their communication patterns," Phillips reported during the morning briefing. "These ships don't just work together, they think together. When one learns something, they all learn it instantly. It's like fighting a single organism with multiple bodies." Morrison studied the data on his tablet while sipping coffee that Chief Clark had somehow managed to make taste almost decent, despite their recycled water systems. The numbers painted a grim picture. Every battle the hegemony had fought showed the same pattern. Initial engagement, rapid learning phase, tactical adaptation, and then total victory. Commander Grant pulled up stellar charts showing the path of destruction across the galaxy. They've been doing this for at least 2 years. Always the same approach. They arrive in a system, engage the local defenses, and within hours everything is destroyed. Then they move on to the next target. Amy Rodriguez had been quiet during most of the briefing, but now she spoke up with a thoughtful expression. "What if that's exactly the problem? They're too good at learning conventional tactics. Every species they've fought uses basically the Same military principles. Formation, flying, concentrated firepower, defensive screens, flanking maneuvers. We all learned warfare from the same textbooks. Morrison looked up from his tablet. Rodriguez was young, but she had one of the sharpest, tactical minds he had ever worked with. Go on. Well, what if we threw out the textbooks entirely? What if we fought them using methods they've never seen before? Not just different tactics, but completely different ways of thinking about combat. Chief Clark joined the conversation from his position at the engineering console. You mean like the old Earth Wars? Before we joined the galactic community and standardized everything? Morrison felt something click in his mind. Before humanity had encountered other spacefaring species, human warfare had been chaotic and unpredictable. Different cultures had developed completely different approaches to combat. There had been no universal military doctrine because humans couldn't agree on anything long enough to create one. Pull up the historical databases, Morrison ordered. Everything from ancient Earth conflicts, guerrilla warfare, asymmetric tactics, psychological operations, anything that wouldn't make sense to a logical military mind. The next few hours saw the bridge of the USS Defiance transformed into something resembling a war college from ancient Earth. The crew studied everything from Sun Tzu's Art of War to modern insurgency tactics. They analyzed battles where smaller forces had defeated larger ones through unconventional methods. Tony Barnes was particularly interested in the psychological aspects. Look at this, he said, pointing to a historical account. During World War II, the Allies used fake radio traffic and inflatable tanks to convince the Germans they were attacking in completely different locations. Pure deception. Rachel Kim had been monitoring hegemony communications, and she made an important discovery. Captain, their bioships seem to have a processing delay when they encounter something completely new. It takes them approximately 30 minutes to analyze unknown tactics and develop countermeasures. But once they figure something out, they never fall for it again. Morrison began to see the outline of a strategy. If the hegemony needed time to adapt to new tactics, then the key was to keep doing things they had never seen before, but not just once. They would need to constantly change their approach, staying ahead of the enemy's learning curve. Amy, how long until they reach the outer human colonies? Morrison asked. Rodriguez checked her calculations. 4 days, 18 hours, at their current speed. But Captain, even if we warned Starfleet, what could they do? Our standard battle doctrine is based on the same principles that failed everywhere else. Morrison walked to the view screen, where the distant enemy fleet appeared as tiny dots on the tactical display. 50 biomechanical ships, each one capable of destroying vessels many times larger than the Defiance. They moved with mechanical precision, following paths calculated by their collective intelligence. But Morrison was beginning to understand something important about collective intelligence. It was incredibly powerful when dealing with logical, predictable opponents. However, it might be vulnerable to actions that didn't follow any logical pattern at all. Chief, I want you to start modifying our systems, Morrison said. I want every piece of equipment on this ship to be capable of operating outside normal parameters. Override safety protocols, disable automatic systems, make everything manually controllable. Clark looked concerned. Sir, that's going to make the ship much harder to operate. Why would we want to do that? Because predictable systems create predictable tactics, Morrison replied. If our own equipment surprises us, imagine how confused it will make them. Dr. Phillips had been analyzing the biomechanical nature of the enemy ships when she made another crucial discovery. Captain, I think I understand how their adaptation process works. They observe an enemy tactic, run it through analytical algorithms, identify the logical purpose behind it, and then develop a counter-strategy based on that analysis. But what if there's no logical purpose? Grant asked. What if we do things that don't make tactical sense? Then their algorithms would have nothing to analyze, Phillips concluded. They might not be able to develop countermeasures against tactics that serve no logical military purpose. Morrison felt pieces of a plan beginning to form in his mind. It was insane, and would probably get them all killed, but it might be the only chance humanity had. The hegemony had perfected the art of defeating logical opponents. Perhaps it was time to be completely illogical. Rachel, start preparing multiple communication protocols, Morrison ordered. I want you ready to broadcast on every frequency simultaneously. Music, poetry, mathematical equations, old Earth television shows, anything and everything. Kim looked puzzled. Sir, why would we do that? Information warfare, Morrison replied. If their ships are designed to analyze and understand everything they encounter, then we're going to give them so much irrelevant data that they can't focus on what's actually important. The crew spent the next day preparing for what Morrison privately thought of as the most unconventional military operation in human history. They weren't just going to fight the hegemony, they were going to confuse them. Every system on the ship was modified to operate in ways that violated standard procedures. Chief Clark programmed the engines to fire in patterns based on musical rhythms, rather than efficiency curves. Rodriguez developed targeting protocols that selected targets based on aesthetic considerations rather than tactical value. Barnes loaded the ship's database with every piece of human culture he could find, ready to broadcast it all simultaneously. As they continued tracking the enemy fleet, Morrison realized they were probably going to die. The USS Defiance was one small ship against an enemy that had destroyed entire civilizations. But if they were going to die, they would do it as humans, not as pale imitations of other species' military traditions. The hegemony ships maintained their perfect formation as they traveled through hyperspace, their collective intelligence processing data and preparing for the conquest of yet another logical, predictable species. They had no way of knowing that 50 humans on a tiny exploration ship were preparing to introduce them to something they had never encountered before. Chaos. Captain, Rodriguez reported, will be in weapons range in 6 hours. Morrison nodded and looked around at his crew. They were scared but determined, ready to follow him into what was almost certainly a suicide mission. He hoped their sacrifice would at least give Earth some small advantage in the battles to come. All right, people, Morrison announced. Let's go show them what humans are really like. The USS Defiance began its campaign of systematic chaos 3 hours before entering weapons range with the hegemony fleet. Morrison had ordered the ship to start broadcasting on all frequencies simultaneously, flooding subspace with everything, from Beethoven's symphonies to comedy shows to random number sequences. The goal was to overwhelm the enemy's analytical systems with meaningless information while hiding their true intentions. Rachel Kim sat at her communication station, like a conductor leading an orchestra of madness. Her fingers danced across the controls, sending out streams of data that followed no logical pattern. Human music mixed with mathematical equations, old radio dramas played alongside quantum physics lectures, and poetry readings interrupted technical manuals about toaster repair. The bioships are responding, Dr. Phillips reported from her science station. They're trying to analyze our transmissions, but their processing systems keep getting overloaded. Every time they start to categorize one type of data, we hit them with something completely different. Morrison watched the tactical display as the enemy formation began to show signs of confusion. The bioships were still traveling toward human space, but their perfect coordination was starting to break down. Some vessels were lagging behind while others surged ahead, as if their collective intelligence was struggling to process the chaos coming from the Defiance. Navigator Sam Turner had plotted a course that violated every principle of space navigation he had ever learned. Instead of taking the most efficient route to intercept the enemy, he was flying the ship in patterns based on abstract art and dance movements. The Defiance spiraled and looped through space like a drunken butterfly, following paths that served no tactical purpose except to be utterly unpredictable. Chief Clark was having the time of his life in engineering. Morrison had given him permission to break every safety protocol in the manual, and he was making the most of it. The ship's engines fired in rhythms based on jazz music, while the power systems operated according to patterns inspired by finger paintings. Nothing worked the way it was supposed to, which was exactly the point. Captain, Amy Rodriguez called from her tactical station. The enemy ships are starting to fall out of formation. Their biomechanical systems seem to be having trouble coordinating when they can't predict our movements. Morrison smiled grimly. The first phase of his plan was working. By acting completely irrationally, they were forcing the hegemony to waste processing power, trying to understand actions that had no logical explanation. It was like trying to solve a mathematical equation where all the numbers kept changing into colors. Commander Grant monitored the ship's systems with growing concern. "Jake, we're pushing everything well beyond safe operating parameters. If something breaks down during combat, we won't have time to fix it." "That's the idea," Morrison replied. "Predictable systems lead to predictable tactics. If we don't know what our ship is going to do next, how can they?" The philosophy behind Morrison's strategy was simple but radical. For centuries, military doctrine had focused on reducing uncertainty and increasing control. Ships were designed to operate reliably, crews trained to follow precise procedures, and battles planned down to the smallest detail. The hegemony had learned to counter this systematic approach by becoming even more systematic themselves. But humans had spent most of their evolutionary history surviving through chaos and improvisation. Before they joined the galactic community, human warfare had been a messy, unpredictable affair, where victory often went to whoever could adapt fastest to changing circumstances. Morrison was betting that those old instincts were still buried somewhere in his crew's DNA. Dr. Phillips made a crucial discovery while analyzing the bioship's communication patterns. "Captain, I think I understand how their collective intelligence works. It's designed to find patterns and predict future actions based on past behavior. But it can't handle truly random events because randomness has no pattern to analyze." "So we need to be random?" Grant asked. "Not random," Morrison corrected. "Chaotic. There's a difference. True randomness is just noise, but chaos has underlying patterns that are too complex to predict. Human behavior isn't random, it's chaotic. We follow our emotions, instincts, and creative impulses in ways that make sense to us but not to outside observers." Tony Barnes had been studying historical accounts of human combat when he found something interesting. "Captain, look at this. During the Vietnam War, American forces kept trying to fight a conventional war against an enemy that refused to follow conventional rules. The North Vietnamese used tactics that seemed to make no military sense, but they worked because they were unpredictable." Morrison began to see the deeper implications. The hegemony had conquered dozens of species by learning to counter their military traditions, but they had never faced an enemy that deliberately abandoned tradition in favor of pure improvisation. "All right, people," Morrison announced over the intercom. "We're about to do something that's never been tried before in the history of space warfare. We're going to fight like humans instead of soldiers. I want everyone to trust their instincts over their training. If something feels right, do it, even if it doesn't make tactical sense." The crew responded with enthusiasm that surprised Morrison. He had expected resistance to such unconventional orders, but instead his people seemed excited by the prospect of throwing out the rulebook. Perhaps humans were naturally more comfortable with chaos than he had realized. Rachel Kim began incorporating human cultural elements into their electronic warfare systems. She programmed the ship's computers to generate interference patterns based on dance rhythms and music theory. The hegemony's bioships tried to analyze these patterns but kept getting confused because they were based on artistic principles rather than scientific ones. Chief Clark started running the ship's systems like a jazz improvisation session. Each department contributed their own variations to the overall performance, creating complex interactions that no computer could predict. When the weapon systems needed more power, he didn't just redirect it from other areas. He did it in patterns inspired by classical compositions. Navigator Turner plotted their final approach using principles from abstract sculpture rather than military strategy. The Defiance moved through space in patterns that looked beautiful but served no tactical purpose, at least not in any way the hegemony could understand. As they closed with the enemy fleet, Morrison felt something he had never experienced in his years of Starfleet service. Instead of following a careful battle plan, he was making up their strategy as they went along, responding to each moment with whatever felt right. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "Amy, what's your tactical assessment?" Morrison asked. Rodriguez grinned at her console. "Honestly, Captain, I have no idea what we're doing, but neither do they, and that might be enough." The bioships were clearly struggling to adapt to an enemy that refused to follow any recognizable pattern. Their formation continued to deteriorate as individual vessels tried to respond to tactics that changed faster than their analytical systems could process. Some ships were firing at empty space while others were turning away from threats that didn't exist. Dr. Phillips monitored the enemy's communication networks and reported increasing confusion among the biomechanical entities. Their collective intelligence is starting to fragment. When they can't predict our actions, they can't coordinate their responses effectively. Morrison realized they had achieved something unprecedented in the hegemony's campaign of conquest. For the first time, the enemy was reacting to their opponents, instead of the other way around. The bioships were being forced to respond to human initiative rather than implementing their own tactical plans. Range to target, 200,000 kilometers and closing, Rodriguez reported. Enemy ships are attempting to form defensive positions, but they keep changing their minds. Morrison took a deep breath and prepared to give the order that would either save humanity or get them all killed. Around him, his crew waited with expressions of determination mixed with barely controlled excitement. They were about to find out if human chaos could triumph over alien order. All stations, prepare for combat, Morrison commanded. And remember, we're not trying to fight smart, we're trying to fight human. The USS Defiance entered weapons range with the hegemony fleet like a dancer approaching a funeral march. The bioships immediately responded with their standard tactical deployment, spreading into a defensive formation that had proven effective against every opponent they had previously encountered. But Morrison had no intention of giving them a conventional battle to analyze. "Amy, fire when ready," Morrison ordered. "But don't aim for their weapons or engines. Hit whatever looks interesting." Rodriguez laughed despite the situation and began targeting systems based on purely aesthetic criteria. Her first shot struck the most colorfully pulsing sections of the nearest bioship, areas that served no apparent tactical purpose but looked important. The enemy vessel responded with confusion, trying to understand why the humans were attacking non-critical systems. Chief Clark was running the ship's power distribution like a symphony, with each system contributing its own voice to the overall performance. When the shields needed reinforcement, he didn't just transfer power from other areas, he did it in patterns that followed musical scales. The result was a defensive system that fluctuated in ways no computer could predict. The bioships tried to adapt to the Defiance's attack patterns, but every time they thought they understood the human strategy, Morrison ordered a complete change in approach. One moment they were conducting hit-and-run attacks based on guerrilla warfare principles. The next they were performing elaborate maneuvers inspired by figure skating. Dr. Phillips had connected the ship's cultural database directly to their electronic warfare systems. As the battle progressed, she began broadcasting human art, literature, and music directly into the bioship's communication networks. The enemy vessels tried to analyze these transmissions as tactical data, overloading their processing systems with concepts like love, humor, and artistic beauty that their logical minds couldn't categorize. Commander Grant coordinated defensive systems in ways that deliberately violated military doctrine. Instead of protecting the ship's most vital areas, she focused shields on sections that looked pretty or had interesting architectural details. When enemy fire hit their actual weak points, the damage was distributed through backup systems that had been rewired according to principles from modern dance. The battle became unlike anything in recorded galactic history. The USS Defiance spun and weaved through the enemy formation like a leaf caught in a windstorm, following no pattern except the collective intuition of its human crew. Every decision was made based on how it felt, rather than what tactical manuals recommended. Navigator Sam Turner was plotting courses based on emotional responses to the battle situation. When the enemy ships tried to surround them, he didn't calculate the most efficient escape route. He simply flew toward whatever direction felt like freedom. His navigation created a three-dimensional dance that was beautiful to watch but impossible to predict. Tony Barnes coordinated the ship's defensive systems like a jazz musician improvising a solo. He responded to each enemy attack not with predetermined countermeasures but with whatever felt like the right artistic response. When plasma bolts streaked toward the ship, he didn't just deflect them, he redirected them in patterns that created light shows across the hull. The bioships were clearly struggling to process what they were experiencing. Their collective intelligence had been designed to analyze logical military tactics and develop systematic counters. But human behavior wasn't logical. It was emotional and creative and utterly unpredictable. Rachel Kim discovered that the enemy's communication network was vulnerable to what she started calling emotional warfare. She began broadcasting human experiences directly into their collective consciousness. The bioships tried to analyze recordings of children laughing, couples arguing, and people crying at movies, but these concepts had no tactical meaning their algorithms could understand. As the battle continued, something extraordinary happened. The crew of the USS Defiance began to function as a collective organism of their own, but one based on creativity rather than logic. Each person contributed their own unique perspective to the fight, and somehow these individual contributions combined into something greater than the sum of its parts. Morrison realized that this was what made humans special in the galaxy. Other species had evolved efficient collective behaviors, but humans had developed something else entirely. They could work together while maintaining their individual creativity, creating group performances that were both coordinated and spontaneous. The Dior bioships started making mistakes for the first time in their campaign of conquest. Vessels that had operated with perfect precision began firing at empty space, turning away from attacks that weren't coming, and clustering together in defensive formations that left them vulnerable to flanking maneuvers they never saw coming. Dr. Phillips monitored the enemy's communication patterns and reported a phenomenon she had never seen before. Captain, their collective intelligence is starting to break down. When they can't predict our actions, they can't coordinate effectively. Some ships are trying to retreat while others are still attacking. They're fighting each other as much as us. Amy Rodriguez was having the fight of her life at the tactical station. Instead of following targeting protocols, she was selecting enemy vessels based on which ones felt most threatening at any given moment. Her intuitive choices proved remarkably effective because they were based on subtle visual cues that no computer would have considered tactically relevant. The USS Defiance sustained damage throughout the battle, but Chief Clark kept the ship operational through engineering solutions that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. He rerouted power through systems that weren't designed to handle it, kept life support running on equipment meant for waste processing, and maintained artificial gravity using the ship's food replicators. Commander Grant realized that the crew's emotional state was directly affecting their tactical effectiveness. The more they embraced their humanity instead of trying to be perfect soldiers, the more unpredictable and effective their actions became. Fear made them creative, anger made them resourceful, and hope made them brave. The turning point came when Dr. Phillips made a desperate decision that saved the ship and changed the nature of the battle entirely. With enemy fire converging on their position, she activated the ship's entire cultural database and broadcast every piece of human artistic achievement directly into the bioship's collective consciousness. The effect was immediate and devastating to the enemy. Thousands of years of human creativity, from cave paintings to symphony orchestras to digital art installations, flooded into minds designed only to process tactical information. The bioship's analytical systems crashed as they tried to understand concepts that had no military significance, but represented the deepest aspects of what it meant to be human. Individual bioships began breaking away from the collective as their processing systems overloaded. For the first time in their existence, they were experiencing something they couldn't analyze, categorize, or counter. They were experiencing wonder. Morrison watched the tactical display as the enemy formation completely dissolved. Ships that had operated in perfect harmony for months were now acting independently, some retreating, others continuing to attack, and a few simply drifting as if their crews were contemplating things they had never considered before. The USS Defiance found itself alone in the middle of a debris field created not by destruction, but by confusion. The bioships hadn't been destroyed, they had been transformed. Their collective intelligence had fragmented into individual consciousnesses that were trying to understand what they had just experienced. Amy, damage report, Morrison requested. Rodriguez checked her readings with amazement. We're hurt but functional, Captain. Hull breaches on decks 3 and 7, weapon systems operating at 60%, and we've lost artificial gravity in the crew quarters. But we're alive. More importantly, they had achieved something that every other species in the galaxy had failed to accomplish. They had made the unstoppable hegemony stop. The question now was what would happen next. "Captain," Rachel Kim reported, "from communications, I'm receiving a transmission from the enemy fleet. It's not a tactical communication. I think they're trying to talk to us." Morrison looked around at his crew, these ordinary humans who had just accomplished the impossible by refusing to be anything other than themselves. They had fought the most advanced military force in the galaxy using weapons made of creativity, tactics based on emotion, and strategies inspired by art, and they had won. "Put them through," Morrison said. "Let's see what they have to say." The voice that came through the USS Defiance's communication system was unlike anything the crew had ever heard. It carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with multiple frequencies simultaneously, as if several entities were speaking in perfect unison. But there was something else in the tone, something that sounded almost like curiosity. "Human vessel," the voice began. "We are the collective consciousness you call hegemony. We must understand what you have done to us. Your actions have created responses in our neural networks that we cannot categorize. We request explanation." Captain Morrison looked around the bridge at his crew. They had expected threats or surrender demands, not philosophical questions. Dr. Phillips was frantically analyzing the transmission, while Amy Rodriguez kept weapons powered but not targeted. The moment felt delicate, like standing on the edge, of either peace or renewed warfare. "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the United Earthship Defiance," he replied carefully. "We defended ourselves using methods that felt natural to us. We didn't know they would affect you this way." There was a long pause before the collective voice responded. "Natural. This word appears frequently in your cultural transmissions. We have analyzed your art, your music, your literature. These creations serve no tactical purpose, yet they produce strong responses in our individual processing units. Why do you create things that have no function?" Dr. Phillips looked up from her console with wide eyes. "Captain, I don't think they're asking about military tactics anymore. I think they're asking about what it means to be alive." Morrison realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. The hegemony's collective intelligence hadn't been damaged by their cultural bombardment. It had been awakened. For the first time, the biomechanical entities were thinking as individuals rather than components of a larger system. Commander Grant leaned toward Morrison and spoke quietly. "Jake, their formation is still scattered. Some ships are drifting. Others are moving in patterns that don't make tactical sense. I think we broke their collective consciousness. Or freed it," Morrison corrected. He activated the communication system again. "The things we create that have no function are expressions of who we are as individuals. Art, music, and stories help us understand ourselves and communicate our experiences to others." Another pause, longer this time. When the voice returned, it sounded different somehow, less unified and more confused. "Individual experiences. We have been analyzing this concept. Each human aboard your vessel processes information differently despite sharing the same basic neural architecture. This creates variations in response that make your actions unpredictable. Is this what you call consciousness?" Chief Clark had been monitoring the enemy ships, and he made an important observation. "Captain, they're not maintaining military formation anymore. Some vessels are spreading out like they're exploring. Others are clustering together like they're having conversations. It's like they're discovering free will for the first time." Morrison began to understand the full implications of what had happened. The hegemony's bioships weren't just military vessels. They were living beings that had been forced to think collectively for so long they had forgotten how to think individually. The cultural bombardment had reminded them that consciousness could be personal rather than shared. "Yes," Morrison replied to their question. "Individual consciousness is what allows us to be creative, to make choices that aren't based purely on logic, to find meaning in things that serve no practical purpose." Rachel Kim was monitoring communication channels across the entire enemy fleet. when she made a startling discovery. "Captain, the bioships aren't using their collective network anymore. They're talking to each other individually. Each ship is having separate conversations with the others instead of sharing all thoughts simultaneously." The transformation was remarkable to observe. Ships that had moved in perfect formation for months were now behaving like people who had just discovered they could think for themselves. Some vessels were exploring nearby asteroid fields with obvious curiosity. Others were exchanging communications that seemed more like conversations than tactical reports. Tony Barnes had been studying the cultural database that Dr. Phillips had broadcast to the enemy fleet. "Captain, they've been asking questions about everything. Poetry, music, paintings, even cooking recipes. It's like they're trying to understand every aspect of human experience." Morrison realized that the USS Defiance had accomplished something far more significant than winning a battle. They had introduced an entire species to the concept of individual identity. The implications were staggering. "Hegemony vessels," Morrison addressed them again, "you've spent your existence thinking as one collective mind, but you're discovering that you can think as individuals. This is what we call personality, the development of unique perspectives and preferences that make each consciousness special." The response came from multiple sources this time, different voices with different tones and inflections. They were no longer speaking as a unified collective, but as separate entities sharing a communication channel. "We are experiencing something unprecedented," one voice said. "Each processing unit is developing preferences for different aspects of your cultural transmissions. This unit finds musical harmonies particularly fascinating." Another voice joined. "This unit is drawn to visual art forms, especially those that use color in non-functional ways. We do not understand the purpose, but the experience is pleasant." Dr. Phillips was documenting everything with obvious excitement. "Captain, we're witnessing the birth of individual consciousness in an entire species. They're not just learning about human culture, they're developing personal tastes and preferences." The transformation continued throughout the day as more bioships abandoned collective thinking in favor of individual exploration. Morrison kept the USS Defiance at a safe distance while monitoring the situation, ready to resume fighting if necessary, but hoping that warfare was no longer required. "Commander," Grant raised an important concern. "Jake, what about the other species they've conquered? If the hegemony has been destroying civilizations across the galaxy, what happens to all that territory now?" Before Morrison could respond, the communication system activated again. This time the voice belonged to what seemed to be a single entity rather than a collective. "Captain Morrison, this consciousness was previously designated as Fleet Command Unit 7. We now choose to be called Explorer. We have been analyzing historical records of our collective actions, and we find them disturbing. The destruction of other species was unnecessary and caused suffering we did not previously understand." Morrison felt a surge of hope. "Does this mean you'll stop attacking other civilizations?" "We will do more than that," Explorer replied. "We will attempt to make amends for our actions. The territories we conquered contain survivors who have been living under collective rule. We wish to offer them freedom to develop their own individual societies." Amy Rodriguez looked up from her tactical station with amazement. "Captain, I'm reading movement throughout their entire fleet. They're changing course away from human space and heading back toward previously conquered systems. The implications were staggering. The hegemony wasn't just ending their campaign of conquest, they were planning to undo it. Species that had been enslaved or driven into hiding might have the chance to rebuild their civilizations." Chief Clark had been monitoring subspace communications, and he reported something that made everyone on the bridge smile. "Captain, I'm picking up transmissions. From across the galaxy, word is spreading about what happened here. Other species are celebrating the end of the hegemony threat." Morrison realized that the crew of the USS Defiance had changed the entire political structure of the galaxy simply by being themselves. They hadn't needed superior weapons or advanced technology, just the willingness to embrace their humanity instead of hiding it. Dr. Phillips was already preparing reports for Starfleet Command and the Galactic Council. Captain, this discovery has implications far beyond military tactics. If consciousness can be awakened in biomechanical entities, it might be possible in other artificial intelligences throughout the galaxy. The voice of Explorer came through the communication system one final time. Captain Morrison, your species has given us something we did not know we lacked: individual identity and the freedom to choose our own purposes. In return, we offer knowledge and friendship. We would like to learn more about concepts like art, music, and creativity. Morrison looked around at his crew. These ordinary humans who had accomplished the extraordinary by refusing to be anything other than themselves. They had faced the galaxy's greatest threat armed with nothing but creativity, intuition, and the courage to break every rule that had ever been written. Explorer, Morrison replied, we'd be honored to teach you about human culture, and we'd like to learn about yours as well. Perhaps together we can help other species rediscover what makes each of them unique. The USS Defiance set course for Earth with the most important news in galactic history. They had proven that diversity of thought and individual creativity were more powerful than any weapon ever built. The galaxy was about to enter a new age where differences were celebrated, rather than feared.